Welcome to this talk on brachial plexus and the upper limb innervation and the relationship between the two. As you can see, my wife's taken over my study to do her sewing, so we'll probably go on location in the shed a bit later on. So what do I expect you to learn from this? Well, I really want to get an understanding of the innervation of the whole of the upper limb and its direct relationships to the brachial plexus. So first of all, have a think and answer these three questions. So press pause on the video and write down your answers. Well, how do you get on? It's just a network of nerves, and it connects the central nervous system to the upper limb. Therefore, it goes from the neck through to the axilla. So, if we flip the question the way around, what innervates the upper limb? Well, it's the brachial plexus and its branches that controls all the motor function and all the sensation of the upper limb, and that includes the shoulder girdle, the arm, the forearm, and the hand. There's one small little exception, and that's trapezius is innervated by the spinal accessory nerve. But in general, if you're thinking about the upper limb and its motor and sensation, it's the brachial plexus controls everything from shoulder to fingertip. And that's why we're focusing on the brachial plexus line. So if it does that, power and sensation, what type of nerves have it got to contain? Spot on. It's got to have the motor nerve fibres and sensory nerve fibres. We've seen there's the connections of the nerve roots in the neck to the upper limb, and these are via peripheral nerves. We're going to focus on these 5, but there's also lots of other branches of the brachial plexus. So let's look at these in slightly more detail. Charlie's shown you how to draw this diagram. Now, when I was a medical student, I used to find this very confusing. It's important we do understand some of the names, and the terminology can be quite difficult. So let's try and simplify this. And in order to do this, let's head to the shed. Let's make a brachial plexus out of this connector and wires. Here we've put the wires to represent the spinal nerves, and here they are from C5 down to T1. The upper 2 spinal nerves form the superior trunk, C7 forms the middle trunk, and the lower 2 form the inferior trunk. Each trunk divides into anterior and posterior divisions, as seen here from above. All the posterior divisions join together to form the posterior cord, and the anterior divisions form the medial and lateral cords. The single posterior cord goes on to form the radial nerve and the auxiliary nerve. The lateral cord goes on to form the musculocutaneous nerve and branches to the median nerve, joined by a branch from the medial cord, which continues on then to form the ulnar nerve. Here's our completed model. Let's change it for a neater one I made earlier. Here we have the spinal nerve roots, C5 to T1. We have the upper trunk, middle and lower trunk. The divisions. Each trunk has an anterior division and a posterior division. The 3 posterior divisions join together to form a single posterior cord. The anterior divisions of the upper 2 trunks form the lateral cord, and the lower trunk forms the medial cord. These are named in relation to the subclavian artery with the lateral cord lateral and the medial cord medial to the subclavian artery. And if we look from above, you can see there's a single posterior cord, and the medial and lateral cords are anterior to the artery. The single posterior cord forms the radial nerve predominantly, but also a smaller axillary nerve. The lateral cord forms the musculocutaneous nerve and gives a branch to the median nerve to form that, accompanied by a branch from the medial cord again to form the median nerve, and the medial cord continues as the ulnar nerve. But it's not quite as simple as that, and here I've made a more complex model with more branches of the brachial plexus on it. As we've said, the brachial plexus innervates the upper limb. Here we can see one or two of those other branches. Here's the long thoracic nerve, and this supplies serratus anterior, which protracts the scapula. We have the lateral and medial pectoral nerves, which innervate pectoralis major, flexing the shoulder and adducting the humerus. And here we can see the thoracodorsal nerve, which actually supplies latissimus dorsi around the back, and you'd expect this to be coming off the posterior cord as it's supplying a muscle posteriorly. And here you can see the other major nerves which we've talked about in our simpler model. So let's look at what each individual nerve root does. C5 supplies motor and sensory function to the musculocutaneous, axillary, median and radial nerves. C6 does the same thing. C7 doesn't supply the axillary nerve, but does supply those other three. C8 gives motor and sensory supply to the median, radial and ulnar nerves, as does T1. So if we summarise that, the musculocutaneous nerve receives motor and sensory supply from the upper three spinal nerve roots, the axillary nerve from the upper two, the median nerve receives it from all five, as does the radial nerve, and we'd expect that because they have quite a large distribution. The ulnar nerve just receives it from the lower two, and again we'd expect that because it's got a lower area of distribution. So now let's look at the individual nerves. We'll start with the radial nerve, which receives motor and sensory supply from all five spinal nerve roots. Remember that the three posterior divisions form one posterior cord, which predominantly goes on to form the radial nerve. Now remember that the posterior aspect of the arm and the forearm are associated with the movement of extension, either extension of the elbow or extension of the wrist. Now if there's only one nerve going down that back of the upper limb, you can expect that there's only one nerve which controls extension. And that's right, so it's the radial nerve. So if you think of anything to do with extension, think about the radial nerve. Think of the emergency room, ER. Extension means the radial nerve. So I'm going to ask you, what innervates extensor carpi radialis? You're going to say radial nerve. What innervates extensor pollicis longus? Radial nerve. What innervates extensor carpi ulnaris? Now remember, it's got that E word at the beginning, extensor, so it's radial nerve. So anything to do with extension from triceps through to the digits is the radial nerve. It also supplies some skin over the posterior surface of the wrist and the hand. Again, you'd expect that because it's formed from the posterior divisions, originally in the brachial plexus. The axillary nerve is a branch of the posterior cord, and it supplies deltoid, which is an abductor of the arm. We'll now talk about the nerves coming off the anterior divisions, i.e. branches of the lateral and medial cords. These nerves are going to supply the anterior muscles and the anterior surface of the arm. And this anterior muscle compartments are associated with the movement of flexion. So flexion of the elbow, flexion of the wrist, and flexion of the digits. The musculocutaneous nerve, coming off the upper 3 spinal nerve roots and the lateral cord, innervates the flexors of the arm, which flex the elbow, biceps and brachialis. The ulnar nerve from the lower 2 trunks is one of the nerves which innervates the flexors of the forearm on the ulnar side of the forearm, so flexor carpi ulnaris and the 2 ulnar heads of flexor digitorum profundus. It also innervates most of the small muscles of the hand. The last nerve we're going to talk about is the one down the middle of the hand, called the median nerve. This receives motor and sensory supplies from all 5 spinal nerve roots, and it receives branches from the lateral and medial cords. We would expect that because the median nerve innervates the majority of the flexors in the forearm, so pronator teres, flexor carpi radialis, the whole of flexor digitorum superficialis, and the 2 heads to the radial sided flexor digitorum profundus, and also the long flexor to the thumb. It also supplies most of the muscles to the thenar eminence. It supplies sensation to this side of the hand towards the thumb. So here's a summary of how the peripheral nerves link in with the spinal nerve root origin. This is going to be quite important when we talk about dermatomes and myotomes and the difference between diseases affecting spinal nerves and diseases affecting peripheral nerves. So the musculocutaneous nerve receives innervation from the upper 3, the axillary just the upper 2, the median from all 5, the radial again from all 5, and the ulnar nerve just from the lower 2. So if you can remember the structure and layout of the brachial plexus, you're going to be able to remember innervation of the upper limb fairly straightforwardly. So let's summarise. Anything to do with the motor and sensory supply of the upper limb, think the brachial plexus and its branches. All the posterior divisions form one posterior cord, and the posterior surface is associated with extension. So the radial nerve controls all the muscles of extension. The anterior divisions form the lateral and medial cords, which are anterior, And these innervates all the muscles of flexion and the small muscles in the hand. So the medial cord goes on to form the ulnar nerve, innervating the ulnar side of the hand and some of the ulnar sided flexors in the forearm and the majority of the intrinsic muscles in the hand. The lateral and medial cords combine together to form the median nerve, which is the remaining other nerve in the hand, which supplies the majority of the flexors in the forearm on the radial side of the flexor compartment, but also it supplies the thenar muscles again on the volar radial side of the hand. If you remember, running to Dirham costs nothing. You can remember the names of the different parts of the brachial plexus as you go from proximal to distal. Remember that it's a three-dimensional structure with the subclavian artery running through it, and that's what gives its name to the posterior cords, the lateral cords, and the medial cords, and the trunks are just the superior, middle and lower, or upper, middle and lower. So hopefully that gives you a good overview of the innervation of the upper limb and its relation directly from the brachial plexus. Thank you.